Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I'm curious how many of you are watching this alone in the dark, perhaps later than you should be. We're here to talk about a book that doesn't exist. The Necronomicon, the forbidden text written by a mad Arab, supposedly bound in human skin, locked away in university libraries, mentioned in stories right before scholars go insane or disappear. H.P. Lovecraft made it up in 1922 as a prop for his stories. That's all it was. And yet, in one of those stories, a character reads from it and finds this passage. That is not dead, which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons, even death may die. For over a century since, people have been looking for this book. Occultists have tried to write their own versions. Libraries get serious requests for it. Some people claim they've read it and were changed by what they found inside. The line between fiction and belief has become uncomfortably thin. This creates an interesting problem. What does it mean when a fake book reveals something real? When something that never existed changes how we see reality? We're going to trace the Necronomicon from its beginning in Lovecraft's letters, through the stories where it appears, and examine what this imaginary grimoire actually claims about our universe. We'll explore the ideas it presents, that humanity is just an accident, that some knowledge can break your mind, that truly understanding reality might cost you your humanity. We'll see how it escaped fiction entirely and became something people treat as real. By the end, you might find yourself in the same spot as those doomed scholars, not corrupted by forbidden knowledge, but carrying an idea you can't forget. Let's start with how Lovecraft built this fiction and why it proved impossible to contain. The Necronomicon first appeared in February 1922 in a story called The Hound. Lovecraft was 31, living in Providence after his mother's death in a mental institution, trying to make money writing for pulp magazines. The book gets one mention, just another cursed object in a story about grave robbers. Nothing about it seemed special, but Lovecraft couldn't let it go. Over the next year, he started adding details in letters to other writers. He built a complete fake history, written by Abdul al-Hazred, a mad poet from Yemen in the 700s, originally called Al-Azif in Arabic, translated to Greek as Necronomicon around 950 AD, later put into Latin, banned by churches, only 5 or 6 copies left in the world, locked in university libraries. He gave specific dates, named the translators, listed where each copy supposedly was. This wasn't just background for one story. Lovecraft was building something bigger. He told his writer friends, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, Robert Bloch, to reference the book in their own stories. When readers saw the same forbidden text mentioned across different authors and different magazines, they started to wonder. Maybe there was something real buried in the fiction. We need to understand what Lovecraft was actually doing here, because it wasn't just atmosphere. His whole project was about destroying the idea that humans matter. He called himself a mechanistic materialist, someone who believed consciousness was an accident, that the universe has no purpose, that humanity means nothing in the vast, empty cosmos. Most horror back then still treated human concerns as important, evil as real, the universe as something you could understand. Lovecraft wanted the opposite. He wanted horror based on the idea that the universe doesn't notice us, that our existence is a fluke, that things older and more powerful than us are as aware of humanity as we are of microbes. This needed a different kind of forbidden book, not spells to summon demons or deals with the devil. Those stories still made humans matter, still gave us power and choice. He needed a text that revealed how small we are, a book containing information that would break your mind, not because it was evil, but because it was true. The Necronomicon became that. It let him reference cosmic histories spanning billions of years without stopping to explain everything. It gave his characters terrible knowledge without forcing him to write out exactly what that knowledge was. Most importantly, it suggested reality works in ways we don't understand and shouldn't want to understand. The book didn't represent supernatural evil. It represented natural truth, too big and too alien for human minds to hold without shattering. Think about what this means for the horror. You can exorcise a demon. You can put a ghost to rest. You can stake a vampire. Those threats exist in human frameworks of good and evil, problems with solutions. But what do you do with knowledge that just shows you how things actually are? How do you fight understanding? The Necronomicon's horror is in its claim to be describing reality, not breaking it. Lovecraft's letters show him working through this explicitly. He writes about cosmic horror as different from supernatural horror, about threats that come from scale and strangeness rather than evil intent. The Necronomicon worked perfectly because it could contain anything, any revelation, any creature, any cosmology, while staying forever half-hidden. He never wrote the actual text. He only showed people reading it and going mad from what they found. This was crucial. By never fully showing what's in the book, Lovecraft left space for readers to imagine horrors more personal than anything he could write. The Necronomicon became something that warps stories around it just by existing in the background, pulling everything toward it like a black hole you never quite see. What Lovecraft created wasn't really a fake grimoire. It was a philosophical weapon aimed at human certainty itself. And once he'd made it, he found he couldn't fully control where it went. Lovecraft didn't invent the idea of a book that drives you mad. He was drawing from a tradition of forbidden texts that stretches back centuries, each one adding something to the formula he'd perfect. The grimoire tradition goes back to medieval Europe. Books like The Key of Solomon and the Picatrix claimed to contain real magical knowledge, formulas for summoning angels or demons, instructions for manipulating reality. These were supposedly ancient texts, translated from Arabic or Hebrew, preserved by secret societies. Church authorities banned them. Scholars whispered about them. Most people never saw them, which made them more powerful. The idea that somewhere, locked away, there existed books containing actual supernatural power that became embedded in Western occult imagination. But those grimoires promised power. They were dangerous because they gave you abilities you shouldn't have. Lovecraft's contribution was making the book dangerous because of what it makes you understand. The more direct influence came from writers working just before him. Arthur Machen's 1904 story, The White People, features a young girl's diary that records her initiation into pre-Christian mysteries. The diary itself is the horror, not what she does with the knowledge, but the knowledge itself, which reveals a world of ancient practices and entities existing alongside mundane reality. The story ends with her death, implying the knowledge was incompatible with continued existence. Machen was exploring the idea that some truths corrupt simply by being known. Then there's Robert Chambers' The King in Yellow, published in 1895. This is the clearest predecessor to the Necronomicon. Chambers wrote about a play, also called The King in Yellow, that drives readers insane. You can read the first act safely. The second act does something to your mind. Characters who finish it end up in asylums or dead. Chambers never shows you the play's contents. He only shows you the aftermath of reading it. The book exists in his stories the way radiation exists, invisible, but leaving measurable destruction. Lovecraft read Chambers and understood what made it work. The unseen text is more powerful than any text you could actually write. But he pushed further. Chambers' play was still supernatural, something outside normal reality. Lovecraft wanted his book to be revealing normal reality, just a version of normal that humans aren't equipped to survive knowing about. His philosophical influences ran deeper than his literary ones. He'd read Schopenhauer, who argued that reality is driven by a blind, purposeless will. That consciousness is a curse, allowing us to recognize the meaninglessness of existence. He'd absorbed Nietzsche's ideas about the abyss that stares back, about how certain truths destroy the person who grasps them. These weren't just abstract philosophy to Lovecraft. They were the foundation of his worldview. The early 1900s also saw a massive occult revival. Theosophy claimed to preserve ancient wisdom from lost civilizations. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn performed elaborate rituals based on supposedly Egyptian and Kabbalistic sources. Aleister Crowley was publishing texts he claimed were channeled from beyond. This was the cultural soup Lovecraft was swimming in, a moment when educated people were genuinely entertaining the idea that mainstream history had it wrong, that ancient civilizations possessed advanced knowledge, that reality contained hidden dimensions. Lovecraft was an atheist and a materialist. He thought the occultists were deluded, but he recognized the power of their central claim, that there exists knowledge too dangerous for mass consumption, that certain truths must be restricted to those prepared to handle them. He just inverted the meaning. The occultists thought forbidden knowledge gave you power. Lovecraft thought it took away the only power humans have, the comfortable delusion that we matter. So the Necronomicon emerged from this combination. Medieval grimoires that promised dangerous power, Machen and Chambers showing that knowledge itself could be corrosive, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche arguing that existence is fundamentally terrible, and occult movements insisting that ancient texts contain reality-altering information. Lovecraft took all of this and made it worse. His book doesn't promise power or enlightenment. It promises understanding, which turns out to be the same thing as annihilation. The Necronomicon's philosophical position is simple and horrible. Reality is not what you think it is. Humans are not what you think they are. And learning the truth about either one will destroy you. The question becomes, if ignorance is the only thing protecting your sanity, what happens when you can't stop yourself from learning? Lovecraft was obsessive about names. He understood that the right name, constructed the right way, could make something feel real even when you knew it was invented. The word Necronomicon is a perfect example of this. It sounds ancient and authoritative, but it's actually a fabrication that doesn't quite work as Greek. He claimed the word broke down as nekros, dead, nomos, law, and icon, image. Depending on how you translate it, you get Book of Dead Names, or Image of the Law of the Dead, or Book of Laws Concerning the Dead. None of these are proper Greek constructions. A real Greek scholar in Lovecraft's time would have spotted the error immediately. But Lovecraft wasn't writing for Greek scholars. He was writing for pulp magazine readers who would see the Greek-looking components and assume scholarly legitimacy. The brilliance is in how the fake etymology still creates meaning. Dead names suggest entities that once existed and might exist again. Law of the dead implies rules governing states of being beyond life. The ambiguity in translation mirrors the book's content. You can never quite pin down what it's saying, because the text resists clear interpretation. Even the title is unreliable. The original Arabic title, Al-Azif, supposedly means the nocturnal sound of insects. Lovecraft claimed this referred to sounds demons make. But think about what this evokes. The chittering, buzzing sounds of insects at night. The sense of small things moving in darkness. Countless tiny entities whose collective noise becomes overwhelming. It's less a title than an auditory hallmark of wrongness. Abdul al-Hazred, the mad Arab poet who supposedly wrote it, was said to have heard these sounds in the desert. Not metaphorically, but actually heard them, coming from something vast moving beneath the sand. Al-Hazred's name itself is revealing. Lovecraft created it as a child when he was reading Arabian Nights, combining it as a kind of Orientalist fantasy. The character emerges from the same tradition as medieval European texts that attributed their forbidden knowledge to the East, to Arabia, to Egypt, to anywhere non-Christian, and therefore mysterious and potentially demonic. This is problematic in obvious ways, rooted in early 20th century racism. But it also served Lovecraft's purpose. Abdul al-Hazred represented someone outside Western Christian frameworks, someone who could access and record knowledge that European civilization had successfully repressed. The fictional publication history adds layers. The Greek translation supposedly happened in 950 AD, created by Theodorus Philetas of Constantinople. The Latin version came in 1228, translated by Olaus Wormius, a real Danish scholar, though he never translated any such text. The English translation was allegedly done by Dr. John Dee in the 1500s, and Dee was real too, Queen Elizabeth's court astrologer and a genuine occultist. By threading his fiction through real historical figures, Lovecraft created plausible deniability. Maybe there was some kernel of truth. Maybe Dee really had seen something. Lovecraft even specified where copies still existed. One at the British Museum, one at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, one at Widener Library at Harvard, one at the University of Buenos Aires, and one at the Library of Miskatonic University in Arkham, Massachusetts. 4 real locations and 1 fictional location. The mixing of real and fake gives everything an uncanny quality. Readers can actually go check the real libraries and find nothing, which somehow makes the absence more meaningful. Something has been hidden. Something has been removed. The language patterns in quoted passages from the Necronomicon follow a specific rhythm. Lovecraft used pseudo-biblical phrasing, archaic constructions, and incantory repetition. When characters quote from it, they use phrases like, "that is not dead, which can eternal lie," or, "in his house at Relia, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming." These don't sound like modern English. They sound like something translated from much older languages, something that has passed through multiple translation stages and retained an alien grammar underneath. The names of entities in the book follow similar principles. Cthulhu, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Shub-Niggurath. These use phonemes that sound wrong in English, combinations that your mouth doesn't want to make. Lovecraft was deliberately creating names that felt unpronounceable, suggesting languages with different vocal structures, entities that existed before human speech patterns evolved. The names themselves become a kind of linguistic body horror. This attention to constructed authenticity is what made the Necronomicon feel real. Lovecraft gave it etymology, publication history, specific library locations, named translators both real and fictional, archaic language patterns, and entities with unpronounceable names. Each detail added weight. The accumulation of false specificity created something that felt more researched than invented. And crucially, he never showed you the whole thing. Every quote is a fragment. Every reference is incomplete. The book remains forever partial, forever suggested rather than revealed. This isn't just narrative technique, it's epistemological position. The Necronomicon can never be fully known because full knowledge would require becoming something other than human. The words themselves are weapons, not because they're magic spells, but because they point toward concepts human language wasn't designed to hold. The Necronomicon became real through a specific trick. Lovecraft treated his fiction like scholarship. He didn't just tell you the book existed, he footnoted it. He provided citations. He referenced it the way you'd reference an actual historical text, with the same casual authority historians use when mentioning documents everyone in their field knows about. Look at how this appears in the stories. A character doesn't say, "I found a scary book." They say, "I consulted the Latin Necronomicon held in the Miskatonic University Library, specifically the 1228 Olaus Wormius translation, comparing it against the Greek text as referenced in the marginalia of Dr. D's fragmentary English notes. The level of unnecessary specificity creates verisimilitude. Real scholars actually write like this, burying their claims under layers of bibliographic detail that most readers won't check. Lovecraft understood something crucial. The way you present information determines whether people believe it. Campfire stories sound like campfire stories. Academic writing sounds authoritative even when it's completely wrong. By framing the Necronomicon through academic conventions, citations, cross-references, scholarly disputes about translation, he gave it the weight of real research. The collaborative expansion amplified this effect. When Clark Ashton Smith mentioned the Necronomicon in his stories, he wasn't just copying Lovecraft, he was corroborating him. When Robert E. Howard's characters encountered the text in completely different settings, it suggested the book had a reality independent of any single author. This is how myths actually function. Multiple sources, slight variations in detail, but core consistency across accounts. The writers built a network of cross-references. Lovecraft would mention Smith's Book of Eibon. Smith would reference Lovecraft's Necronomicon. Robert Bloch would cite both while adding his own fictional texts like De Vermis Mysteriis. They were creating a fictional bibliography that supported itself, each text lending credibility to the others. Readers saw these names appearing across different magazines, different authors, different years. The accumulation suggested a hidden body of forbidden literature that pulp writers were carefully documenting. What made this especially effective was the restraint. None of them wrote extended passages from these texts. They quoted fragments, a sentence here, a paragraph there, always incomplete. The Necronomicon, in particular, remained frustratingly partial. You'd get ritual instructions without full context, entity descriptions without complete information, cosmological claims without supporting details. Every quote raised more questions than it answered. This mirrors how real esoteric texts actually circulate. The Key of Solomon exists, but most people haven't read it and can only cite passages they've seen quoted elsewhere. The Picatrix was legendary for centuries before scholars could access actual copies. Forbidden or rare texts become known through fragments and references rather than direct reading. Lovecraft was replicating that pattern artificially. He also built in institutional restrictions. The book wasn't in regular circulation. It was held in university libraries with restricted access. it required special permission to view. This explained why characters in the stories had limited access while maintaining that complete copies existed somewhere. The restriction added to the authenticity. Of course, forbidden knowledge would be institutionally controlled. The fictional librarians and scholars added another layer. Dr. Henry Armitage at Miskatonic University, who appears in multiple stories, becomes the institutional guardian of these texts. He studied them, understands their danger, and carefully regulates who can access them. This is how real rare book libraries function. Having a named librarian who knows the material makes the library itself feel real. Lovecraft's letters show him deliberately constructing this infrastructure. He wrote detailed timelines of when texts were written, translated, banned, and rediscovered. He specified which historical figures might have encountered them. He even joked about the project with his fellow writers, acknowledging they were building a hoax while simultaneously taking it seriously as world building. The hoax worked because it exploited how knowledge actually circulates. Most people don't verify sources. They don't trust that if something is cited frequently enough, someone must have checked it. If 5 different authors mention the Necronomicon, readers assume it must exist. If scholars and stories treat it as real, readers unconsciously absorb that reality. The ambiguity helped. Lovecraft never definitively stated whether the book was supposed to be literally real within his fictional universe or just a story device. This left space for readers to wonder. Maybe it was a real text that inspired Lovecraft's fiction. Maybe he'd encountered something and was obscuring it through fantastic stories. The uncertainty became part of the mythology. By the 1930s, libraries were receiving actual requests for the Necronomicon. People wrote to Miskatonic University asking for access, not realizing the university was fictional. The myth had escaped the stories. Lovecraft would sometimes respond to these letters, gently explaining he'd made it up, but adding little details that suggested maybe, possibly, there was some truth buried in the invention. What he'd created was a feedback loop. Fiction that looked like scholarship, generating real belief, which then became part of the cultural reality that new readers encountered. The Necronomicon existed as a meme before we had that word, a self-replicating idea that propagated through culture, independent of its truth value. The final element was leaving it forever incomplete. Lovecraft died in 1937 without ever writing the actual Necronomicon. The text remained suggestion and fragment. This turned out to be essential. The moment someone writes the real Necronomicon, they destroy the ambiguity that gives it power. The book's horror depends on it remaining just beyond reach. Something referenced, quoted, gestured toward, but never fully present. What Lovecraft built wasn't a book. It was a space where a book should be, a gap in reality that pulls at your mind the way actual gravity pulls at matter. The myth works because it's incomplete. The moment it becomes complete, it stops being mythological and becomes just another book you could read or not read. The horror is that you can never read it. But you can't stop trying to imagine what's in it. And the more you imagine, the more real it becomes, until you're no longer sure whether you're creating the book or discovering it. The Necronomicon's central claim is simple and devastating. Humanity doesn't matter, not in a poetic or metaphorical sense, but as cosmological fact. We are accidents, brief biological experiments on a planet that has hosted countless other experiments, most of them more successful and longer lasting than us. This is cosmic insignificance as philosophy. Traditional religion places humans at the center of creation, made in God's image, granted dominion over nature, promised eternal life. Even secular humanism retains the idea that human consciousness is special, that our capacity for reason and creativity marks us as uniquely valuable. The Necronomicon rejects all of this. According to its cosmology, humans emerged recently on a planet ruled for billions of years by entities vastly older, more powerful, and more durable than anything our species will produce. We're not the pinnacle of evolution. We're temporary inheritors of a world that will inevitably be reclaimed by its previous occupants. The book describes cyclical time on scales that make human history invisible. Civilizations rise and fall across billions of years. The entities the text calls the Old Ones existed when Earth was young, building cities and technologies that functioned according to principles we'd call magic, simply because we lack the framework to understand them. They didn't die out, they retreated, or were sealed away, or entered states of dormancy that our language struggles to describe. The Necronomicon insists they're waiting, not plotting or planning, because that implies human-style consciousness and intention. Just waiting for conditions to shift back into configurations that allow their return. When the stars are right appears repeatedly in quoted passages from the text. This isn't astrology, it's a claim about physical reality, that cosmic alignments, gravitational configurations, and astronomical cycles create windows when the barriers between dimensions thin or when dormant entities can wake. Human agency is irrelevant to this process. We can't prevent it. We can only recognize it's happening and understand we're about to be displaced. The book presents entropy as inevitability. Everything tends toward disorder. Civilizations collapse. Knowledge is lost. What humans call progress is temporary local organization against a universal trend toward chaos. The Old Ones aligned themselves with entropy rather than fighting it. They built civilizations that accepted decay as inherent, that treated death and transformation as natural cycles rather than tragedies to resist. This is why they endure when human civilizations fail. They aren't fighting reality's fundamental direction. But here's where it gets worse. The Necronomicon claims consciousness itself is a defect. Human awareness, our capacity for self-reflection and meaning-making, is presented as an evolutionary mistake. We suffer because we're conscious enough to recognize patterns and create narratives, but not conscious enough to perceive reality accurately. We're trapped in a cognitive middle ground, where we can sense there's something wrong with our understanding, but can't access the understanding that would fix it. The text supposedly describes reality as fundamentally dreamlike, not metaphorically, but literally. Existence as we experience it is a kind of dream being dreamed by something vast and mindless. Azathoth, the blind idiot god at the center of the universe, generates reality as a side effect of its existence, the way your brain generates dreams as a side effect of neural activity during sleep, or incidental byproducts of a process that isn't aware it's creating us. And like dreams, our reality is provisional, unstable, subject to sudden shifts if the dreamer stirs. This is materialist horror at its purest. The supernatural doesn't exist. Everything described in the Necronomicon is natural. It's just that nature is far stranger and more hostile than human intuition suggests. The entities aren't demons from hell. They're physical beings from other dimensions or earlier epochs. The spells aren't supernatural incantations. They're instructions for manipulating physics in ways that require math and geometry incompatible with three-dimensional Euclidean space. What makes knowledge forbidden, then, isn't that it's evil. It's that human minds aren't structured to process it. Think about trying to explain color to someone born blind, or music to someone born deaf. Now imagine trying to explain four-dimensional geometry to a brain that evolved to navigate 3 dimensions, or trying to grasp billion-year time, scales when your species has existed for a few 100,000 years. The information doesn't fit. Trying to force it in breaks the container. The Necronomicon presents learning this truth as irreversible. Once you understand that consciousness is a defect, that humanity is temporary, that reality operates on scales and principles completely alien to human experience, you can't go back to comfortable ignorance. The knowledge rewrites you. Characters who read the text and comprehend what it's saying don't go mad in the theatrical sense, raving and incoherent. They go quiet. They stop participating in human concerns because they've seen those concerns from a cosmic perspective, where they become absurd. The book's ultimate philosophical position is that ignorance isn't a failure of education. It's a survival mechanism. Humans persist because we don't understand our actual position in reality. We tell ourselves stories about mattering, about progress, about meaning. These stories are false, but they're necessary. The Necronomicon offers to strip them away and show you what's really there. The question it poses is simple. If truth destroys you, is it still worth knowing? And the horror is that you can't unask the question. Once you're curious about what's in the book, you've already begun the process of learning things you can't survive knowing. The Necronomicon catalogs beings that occupy the space between gods and animals, treated with the same clinical distance an encyclopedia uses for describing extinct species. These aren't supernatural entities. They're presented as physical creatures whose biology and physics operate according to rules that predate and supersede the rules governing human existence. Cthulhu is the most famous, described in the text as a priest or high priest of the old ones rather than a god himself. The descriptions we get through story fragments present something massive, city-sized, vaguely humanoid, but wrong in every detail. Octopoid head, dragon wings, body like corrupted flesh that doesn't quite obey spatial constraints the way solid matter should. But the physical description matters less than the condition. Dead but dreaming, sealed in the sunken city of Erlier, waiting for geological and astronomical conditions that will allow the city to rise and Cthulhu to wake. The horror of Cthulhu isn't that he's evil. It's that human concepts like good and evil don't apply. He existed before humans evolved. He'll exist after we're gone. His dreams leak into sensitive human minds, producing cults and artwork and religious visions that are really just psychic contamination from a sleeping alien entity. We're not important enough to be his enemies. We're barely important enough to be his dreams' side effects. Yog-Sothoth occupies a different conceptual space, described in the Necronomicon as the key and the gate, something that exists outside normal space-time. The text treats Yog-Sothoth as coterminous with all time and space, able to access any point in history or any location in the universe simultaneously. Characters who encounter Yog-Sothoth don't see a creature. They experience something more like a phenomenon, an intersection of dimensions that their senses can't properly parse. Descriptions fragment into contradictions, all-seeing eyes, infinite spheres, geometries that hurt to look at. What makes Yog-Sothoth particularly disturbing is the implication that it's conscious and can communicate, but its perspective is so alien that communication becomes a form of assault. It doesn't think in language or concepts. It thinks in something more fundamental, raw information about the structure of reality. Trying to receive that information as a human is like trying to download the entire internet directly into your brain. The hardware can't handle it. Azathoth gets described as the blind idiot god at the center of infinity, surrounded by servitor creatures that play flutes and drums to keep it asleep. This is the Necronomicon at its most nihilistic, the suggestion that at the very center of existence, generating reality itself, is something mindless and chaotic. Not a loving creator, not an intelligent designer, just blind, purposeless process, generating everything as accident. If Azathoth fully wakes, if the music stops, reality might simply cease, not destroyed, but uncreated, revealed as something that was never properly real to begin with. Shub-Niggurath appears in the text as a fertility entity called the Black Goat of the Woods with 1,000 young, associated with life and reproduction, but in ways that emphasize horror rather than celebration. The entity represents uncontrolled proliferation, life that spreads and mutates and generates new forms without purpose or design, pure biological expansion divorced from any organizing principle. This is life as cancer, as invasive species, as process without telos. The Necronomicon doesn't present these beings as part of a hierarchy or system. They're not demons serving Satan or angels serving God. They're just things that exist, each following their own alien imperatives, their own incomprehensible purposes. Some are imprisoned, some are dormant. Some exist in dimensions adjacent to ours. Some are active but indifferent to humanity. The text cataloging them reads less like theology than like taxonomy, descriptions of organisms classified by their properties and behaviors. What links them all is their relationship to time and space. These entities existed before Earth's current geological epoch. They'll exist after. They operate on billion-year timescales where human civilization is a brief flicker. The Necronomicon claims Earth has been dominated by different forms of life across its history. Fungal civilizations, crustacean empires, species that communicated through colors or chemicals or quantum entanglement rather than sound. Humans are just the current tenants of a building that's been occupied many times before. The book describes these previous tenants leaving remnants, cities buried under Antarctic ice, structures at the bottom of the Pacific, ruins in desert caves that predate any known human settlement. Sometimes these remnants are dormant technology. Sometimes they're eggs or spores. Sometimes they're the creatures themselves, in states of hibernation that blur the line between alive and dead. That is not dead, which can eternal lie, the most famous line from the Necronomicon, suggests death itself is a human concept that doesn't apply to beings with access to different states of existence. Crucially, the text presents worship of these entities as cargo cult behavior. Humans who encounter evidence of the old ones misinterpret advanced technology or biology as supernatural power and develop religions around it. The cults that form aren't serving the entity's purposes. They're just humans doing what humans do when confronted with things they can't understand, creating rituals and hierarchies and meaning where none exists. The entities don't need worship. They barely notice it. But humans need to worship something, so they worship even things that don't want or recognize their devotion. The final disturbing element is the suggestion that these entities can interbreed with humans. Several Necronomicon passages supposedly describe bloodlines, hybrids, ways of altering human biology to make it compatible with alien forms. This isn't presented as supernatural transformation. It's genetics, alien DNA integrating with human DNA, producing offspring that are human enough to survive, but alien enough to serve as anchors or conduits. The body horror here is profound. Your flesh as territory that can be colonized. Your genome as something that can be edited to serve purposes that have nothing to do with your survival or well-being. The entities in the Necronomicon aren't monsters in the fairy tale sense. They're more like natural disasters, given form, inevitable, impersonal, operating according to their own principles regardless of human concerns. And the book claims they're coming back, not as invasion or apocalypse, but as return to ownership. We're living in their house. Eventually, they'll want it back. The Necronomicon presents madness, not as mental illness, but as accurate perception. When characters go insane after reading the text, they haven't broken from reality. They've broken from the comfortable human consensus about what reality is. They've seen something true, and their minds couldn't hold it. This reframes the entire relationship between knowledge and sanity. Normally, we treat knowledge as beneficial. Education expands your mind, gives you tools, makes you more capable. The Necronomicon inverts this. Some knowledge is structurally incompatible with human psychology. Learning it doesn't enhance you, it damages you. And the damage is permanent because you can't unlearn something once you truly understand it. Think about what this means for the scholars who encounter the book. They're typically educated, rational people, professors, researchers, antiquarians who've devoted their lives to accumulating knowledge. These aren't superstitious peasants or uneducated fanatics. They're exactly the people you'd expect to handle obscure texts responsibly. And that's precisely why they're vulnerable. Their intellectual openness, their commitment to understanding, their refusal to dismiss uncomfortable ideas. These scholarly virtues become liabilities when the idea itself is toxic. The progression follows a pattern across the stories. First comes curiosity. Finding a reference to the Necronomicon, tracking it down, gaining access to a copy. Then comes initial reading, where passages seem like mythology or primitive cosmology, strange but digestible. Then comes the moment of comprehension, where the reader suddenly grasps that the text isn't mythology. It's description, documentation, measurement of real phenomena. This is when the damage occurs. The mind tries to integrate this information and finds it can't do so without abandoning fundamental assumptions about reality that human psychology depends on. The madness manifests in specific ways. Some characters become catatonic, withdrawing into near vegetative states. This looks like shutdown, but functions more like escape. Consciousness retreating from information it can't process. Others become obsessive, unable to stop researching, driven to verify what they've read through archaeological investigation or mathematical proof. They're trying to find evidence that disproves the Necronomicon's claims, but every piece of evidence confirms it instead, pulling them deeper into the understanding that's destroying them. Some develop what the stories call racial memory nightmares, dreams where they experience scenes from billions of years ago, seeing Earth's previous dominant species and their civilizations. These aren't fantasies. The Necronomicon suggests consciousness isn't entirely individual, that information can be stored in genetic material or in what we'd now call morphic fields, accessible under the right conditions. The dreams are memory playback from periods before human consciousness existed. You're experiencing history directly from perspectives that aren't human, and your mind isn't designed to maintain coherent identity across that kind of temporal and species displacement. The scholar's trajectory becomes predictable once they engage seriously with the text. They start by treating it as historical document, analyzing its claims with academic distance. They look for corroborating evidence, archaeological finds, astronomical data, geological records. They find it. Ancient cities in the wrong locations, star patterns that align with the text's astronomical descriptions, fossil records showing species that match the book's descriptions of pre-human Earth inhabitants. Each confirmation pulls them further in. At some point, they realize they're not studying the text anymore. They're being recruited by it. The book functions as a kind of filter or sorting mechanism, identifying humans capable of understanding and moving them towards some purpose that serves the old one's agenda. Not directly, there's no conspiracy or intentional manipulation. It works more like natural selection. The book exists. Some humans read it. Most can't understand it. Those who can understand it begin acting in ways that align with the old one's interests, not because they're being controlled, but because once you understand the cosmic situation, certain courses of action become logical. This is where suicide enters the picture. Characters who fully comprehend what the Necronomicon reveals sometimes kill themselves, but not from despair, from clarity. They've understood that human consciousness is temporary, that their individual existence means nothing in cosmic terms, that the best contribution they can make is removing themselves from a universe that doesn't need them. The suicide isn't madness. It's the sanest response to accurate information about reality. The madness was thinking human life mattered. Others don't die, but stop participating in human society. They become hermits or wanderers, unable to care about normal human concerns once they've seen those concerns from a cosmic perspective. Jobs, relationships, social obligations, cultural norms, all of it looks like children's games to someone who's grasped geological timescales and alien intelligence. They're not misanthropic. They've just shifted reference frames in ways that make human drama invisible. The paradox the Necronomicon creates is this. Those who understand it fully can't communicate what they understand, because language evolved for human-scale concerns and fails when pushed to cosmic scales. And those who can communicate about the book haven't really understood it yet. They're still operating within human frameworks, treating it as mythology or fiction or academic curiosity. The gap between comprehension and communication means the book's knowledge can't be transmitted through normal scholarly channels. You can't warn people effectively. You can only watch them make the same journey you did. The cults represent a different kind of response. People who've encountered the book or its ideas secondhand and built religion around it. They misunderstand everything. They think worship matters. They think rituals can summon or control the old ones. They think they'll be rewarded for their devotion. The Necronomicon makes clear none of this is true, but cult members don't read carefully or don't comprehend what they are reading. They've taken the book's descriptions and forced them into human religious frameworks, where entities that don't care about humanity get recast as gods who desire worship. These cults serve a function, though. They preserve and propagate the EI text even as they misunderstand it. They copy it, translate it, reference it in their own writings. They act as carriers, spreading the book through culture the way disease carriers spread infection without necessarily suffering its full effects themselves. The scholars eventually die or go silent. The cults continue, generation after generation, keeping the Necronomicon in circulation until the next person capable of actually understanding it comes along. What the book reveals about human psychology is uncomfortable. We're not built for truth. We're built for survival. And sometimes those imperatives conflict. The mind that can grasp cosmic reality is a mind that stops functioning for human purposes. The Necronomicon functions as proof that ignorance isn't a bug in human cognition. It's a feature. We're designed not to understand certain things because understanding them is incompatible with continuing to exist as humans. The final horror is that you can't regulate this information. You can lock the book in a restricted library, but someone will always find it. You can burn copies, but others survive. You can warn people, but warnings only increase curiosity. The knowledge wants to be found, not because it's conscious, but because that's how information behaves in human culture. Forbidden knowledge has gravity. The more you try to restrict it, the more it attracts exactly the people capable of understanding it, and therefore most vulnerable to its effects. The Necronomicon's core function is epistemic. It collapses the knowledge frameworks humans use to navigate reality. This isn't metaphorical. The book describes things that are true but incompatible with the assumptions human cognition depends on. Learning these truths requires dismantling the mental structures that make you functionally human. Start with geometry. The text supposedly contains descriptions of non-Euclidean space. Geometries where parallel lines intersect, where angles don't sum to 180. Degrees, where the shortest distance between 2 points isn't a straight line. This sounds like abstract mathematics, but the Necronomicon presents it as physical description. Certain spaces on Earth, underwater cities, Arctic ruins, desert caves, don't obey Euclidean geometry. They curve in ways three-dimensional space shouldn't allow. Your eyes report impossible configurations. Your spatial sense fails because the rules it evolved to follow don't apply. This isn't supernatural. It's what happens when regions of four-dimensional or five-dimensional space intersect with our three-dimensional universe. The geometry is natural to higher dimensions, but appears impossible from our limited perspective. The horror is that your brain can't process it. You see the walls curve wrong, see doorways that connect to spaces that shouldn't exist, see distances that don't match up. The information comes in through your eyes, but your visual cortex can't construct a coherent model from it. The attempt produces physical pain, vertigo, eventually lasting perceptual damage. The book contains formulas, mathematical and linguistic instructions for manipulating reality's substrate. These aren't spells in the fantasy sense. They're more like cheat codes, ways of accessing underlying systems that normal existence runs on top of. Reality has rules, but those rules have rules, and the Necronomicon supposedly documents how to interact with the lower-level system. The catch is that using these formulas requires thinking in frameworks human minds aren't designed for, holding contradictory information simultaneously, performing calculations that break conventional logic. One frequently referenced formula involves resurrection, bringing back the dead, or more precisely, reassembling consciousness from essential salts extracted from corpses. This is presented as chemistry plus dimensional manipulation. Consciousness isn't supernatural soul. It's information stored in matter. If you have the right information in the right process, you can reconstruct it in new matter. But what comes back isn't quite the original person. It's a copy that remembers being that person, thinks it's that person, but has spent time outside conventional space-time, and returns with knowledge from wherever consciousness exists between incarnations. The temporal implications are worse. The Necronomicon describes time as non-linear, as something you can navigate if you have the right formulas and the right understanding of cosmic cycles. This means the past isn't fixed, or rather, it is fixed, but you can access it, observe it, potentially interact with it from positions outside the normal flow of cause and effect. Characters who use these techniques report seeing Earth's history play out, watching civilizations rise and fall across billions of years, seeing their own future deaths and the species-ending events that are coming. This creates causal loops and paradoxes. Information from the future affects the past. Entities from the past take actions that influence their own imprisonment or release. The linear narrative of history that humans depend on, cause preceding effect, past determining future, breaks down. You can meet yourself at different ages. You can witness your own death before it happens. You can receive instructions from future versions of people who haven't written them yet. The Necronomicon treats this as natural consequence of understanding time's real structure, rather than the simplified version human perception provides. The resurrection protocols deserve special attention because they reveal how the book treats consciousness. If you can extract someone's essential information and rebuild them in new matter, what does that say about identity? Are you the same person? The Necronomicon suggests consciousness is more like a pattern than an entity, information that can be stored, transmitted, copied. Death is just the pattern losing coherence, dispersing back into the informational substrate of reality. Resurrection is pattern reconstruction. But the reconstructed pattern has been edited by its time outside material form, has accessed information not available to living minds, comes back changed in ways that make it dangerous. What makes knowledge forbidden in this framework isn't moral restriction. It's structural incompatibility with human survival. Some truths are incompatible with the cognitive architecture that makes you functional as a human being. Your brain evolved to recognize faces, track social hierarchies, predict weather patterns, hunt prey, avoid predators. It wasn't designed to grasp billion-year timescales or extra-dimensional geometry or the provisional nature of physical law. Forcing it to process that information is like running software on hardware it wasn't designed for. You get crashes, corruption, permanent system damage. The book describes consciousness as defect more explicitly in its later passages. Human awareness is presented as an evolutionary accident, a side effect of brains becoming complex enough to model reality, but not complex enough to model it accurately. We're trapped in the worst possible position, aware enough to recognize we're missing something, not aware enough to perceive what we're missing. This creates suffering, the existential anxiety that comes from being conscious but cosmically insignificant, from having experiences that feel meaningful, but recognizing at some level that meaning is projection rather than discovery. The Necronomicon offers to resolve this through what we'd now call ego death, or consciousness dissolution. If you fully integrate its knowledge, you stop identifying as human, stop experiencing yourself as a separate entity. You don't die, but you stop existing as coherent self-concept. What remains is consciousness without identity, awareness without personhood. Characters who reach this state become effectively hollow, physically alive, but no longer operating as individuals. They've merged with something larger, or been absorbed into it, or realized they were never separate from it to begin with. This connects to the book's claims about the old ones. They don't have individual identity the way humans do. They're more like organs of a single vast organism, or processes within a larger system, or perhaps points of greater density in a field of consciousness that extends across dimensions. The Necronomicon suggests this is the natural state. Identity is the anomaly. the temporary glitch that emerges in sufficiently complex biological systems before dissolving back into the larger pattern. Humans who understand this can choose to dissolve their identity voluntarily rather than waiting for death to do it involuntarily. The final epistemic collapse is realizing the book might be right. Not right in its specific claims about Cthulhu or Yog-Sothoth. Those could be metaphor or translation error or Lovecraft's invention. But right in its core thesis, that reality operates according to principles alien to human intuition, that consciousness is provisional, that what we call knowledge is mostly agreed upon fiction serving social coordination rather than accurate perception. Modern physics has independently arrived at claims nearly as disturbing, that observers affect what they observe, that particles exist in superposition until measured, that time might not flow the way we experience it, that the universe might be simulation or hologram or mathematical structure with no physical existence at all. The Necronomicon just reached these conclusions centuries earlier through different methods, and added the claim that truly understanding them is incompatible with remaining functionally human. You can know reality, or you can live in society, but not both. The choice the book presents is between comfortable ignorance and devastating accuracy. What makes this forbidden knowledge isn't that someone forbids it. It's that reality itself seems to restrict access through the mechanism of madness, like a security system that destroys anyone who successfully breaks in. The information exists. It's accessible. But accessing it costs you your humanity. You can learn the truth about what you are and where you are, but the price is becoming something other than human. Something that knows but no longer cares. Something that understands but can't communicate. Something that sees clearly and wishes it couldn't. The book's ultimate message might be simpler than all this. Some questions shouldn't be answered, because the answers are worse than the uncertainty. But once you've asked the question, once you've started looking for the answer, you can't stop. Curiosity becomes compulsion. The Necronomicon is less a book than a trap, information arranged to catch minds of a certain type and pull them toward truths they're not equipped to survive. The Necronomicon's first appearance in The Hound, 1922, is almost forgettable. Two grave robbers, wealthy decadents seeking thrills through desecration, steal an amulet from a tomb in Holland. The amulet bears a grotesque and formidable skull and characters they can't identify. One character mentions consulting books on occult subjects, including The Forbidden Necronomicon of the Mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred. That's it, one sentence. No description of what's in the book. No explanation of why it's forbidden. Nothing about its contents. The story focuses on the supernatural hound that hunts them for their theft, not on the book itself. But Lovecraft had planted a seed. By the festival, 1923, the book gains substance. The narrator visits Kingsport for a family gathering that turns out to be a ritual. He's led to an underground chamber where robed figures conduct ceremonies. There he finds ancient books, and specifically, there were diagrams and formulae in the one book opened before the leader. And I somehow dreaded the way the flickering light from the tripod lamps made the shadows of this nameless volume's title waver on the wall. Later he sees references to things that should not be, and rituals for communing with beings from outside normal space. The Necronomicon here functions as instruction manual, a text that tells you how to perform actions that violate natural law, or what humans think of as natural law. The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, expands the book's reach globally. Inspector Legrasse encounters a cult in Louisiana, swamps performing ceremonies around a hideous idol. When he brings the case to archaeological societies, Professor Webb of Princeton recognizes elements and consults the dreaded Necronomicon, which reveals information about Cthulhu and the cult's chant, Fung Lui Maglwinaf Cthulhu Relie Wagah Nagulftagen. In his house at Relie, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. The book here serves as decoder ring, translating the cult's actions into cosmological context. It's not just that the book describes Cthulhu, it's that cults worldwide have been worshipping this entity for millennia without realizing they're part of a global phenomenon. The Necronomicon is the only text that connects these disparate cults, suggesting someone compiled information about them centuries ago. This story also introduces the idea that the book's knowledge spreads through dreams. Artists and sensitive individuals around the world experience nightmares during the period when Cthulhu's influence briefly increases. They create sculptures and paintings of the entity without knowing what they're depicting. The Necronomicon documents this phenomenon, that psychic contamination from the old ones can affect humans who've never encountered the book itself. The text becomes one transmission vector among many, though the most direct and dangerous one. The Dunwich Horror, 1928, provides the most extensive quotes from the Necronomicon in any Lovecraft story. Dr. Armitage consults the Latin translation held at Miskatonic University's library, finding passages about Yog-Sothoth and methods for opening gateways between dimensions. The text explains that the old ones were, the old ones are, and the old ones shall be, placing them outside normal temporal sequence. It describes Yog-Sothoth as existing coterminously with all time and space, able to manifest when the stars are right and specific rituals are performed. These aren't vague mystical claims. They're presented as physics, descriptions of how dimensional barriers work and what conditions allow them to be breached. Critically, the story shows the book being used as weapon. Armitage doesn't just read it for knowledge. He uses its counter-formulas to banish the creature terrorizing Dunwich. The Necronomicon contains both summoning instructions and dismissal protocols, suggesting it was compiled by people who understood these entities well enough to document not just their existence, but methods for interacting with them safely, or as safely as interaction with dimensional beings allows. At the Mountains of Madness, 1931, references the book indirectly through discoveries in Antarctica. The expedition finds a city built by the Elder Things, a pre-human species that colonized Earth billions of years ago. The architecture and hieroglyphs match descriptions from certain primal myths and forbidden pre-human texts. While Lovecraft doesn't explicitly name the Necronomicon, the implication is clear. The book's descriptions of Earth's previous inhabitants were accurate. The Antarctic city is physical proof of what the text claimed. This story establishes crucial context. The Necronomicon isn't describing supernatural entities, but providing natural history of species that predated humanity. The gods are just older life forms with advanced technology. The magic is just science humans don't understand yet. The book's horror comes from being right, not from being supernatural. The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, shows the book in academic circulation. Professor Wilmarth corresponds with Henry Akeley about strange events in Vermont's hills, alien creatures that predate human evolution and still inhabit remote regions. Akeley references texts including the Necronomicon as sources documenting these beings. The story treats the book as research material, something scholars consult when investigating anomalies. It's forbidden, but not inaccessible, held in university libraries where qualified researchers can examine it under supervision. This academic framing is crucial to the book's mythologization. It's not a spell book hidden in some wizard's tower. It's a rare manuscript in restricted collections at real universities. Harvard's Widener Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Miskatonic's Special Collections. The mundane institutional context makes it feel more real than any amount of dramatic mysticism would. The cross-references between stories create self-reinforcing mythology. When the Call of Cthulhu mentions cults in Louisiana, Arabia, and the Pacific Islands all worshiping the same entity, and the Necronomicon is the text that explains this global pattern, it suggests the book was compiled by someone who traveled widely or had access to international accounts. When the Dunwich Horror shows specific rituals from the book being used successfully, it confirms the text contains functional information rather than just mythology. When At the Mountains of Madness provides physical evidence matching the book's claims, it validates the text as historical document. Each story adds details that later stories treat as established fact. By the time Lovecraft was writing his major works in the late 1920s and early 1930s, he could reference the Necronomicon with the casual authority you'd use for citing a real historical text. His characters quote it, debate its translations, compare different editions, argue about its historical accuracy, all the scholarly apparatus that surrounds actual ancient manuscripts. The accumulation of these references across multiple stories made the book feel researched rather than invented. Other writers amplified this effect. Robert E. Howard mentioned it in his Conan stories, placing it in the context of pre-cataclysmic civilizations. Clark Ashton Smith referenced it alongside his own invented texts like the Book of Ibon. Robert Bloch's stories featured characters who'd read both the Necronomicon and his fictional grimoire De Vermis Mysteries, creating a whole library of forbidden texts that all corroborated each other. This wasn't collaboration in the modern sense. It was writers playing in a shared sandbox, building mythology through accumulated references. The result was a feedback loop. Readers encountered the Necronomicon across multiple authors, multiple magazines, multiple years. Each reference assumed you already knew what it was, treating it as established fact rather than explaining it from scratch. This mimicked how real esoteric texts circulate, through references and allusions rather than direct quotation. The book became famous for being famous, referenced because it was referenced, gaining reality through repetition until people started to wonder if maybe, possibly, somewhere in all this fiction there was a kernel of truth. The Dunwich Horror gives us the clearest picture of how the Necronomicon functions when someone actually uses it. The story centers on Wilbur Whately, born to a degenerate family in rural Massachusetts in 1913. His grandfather, Old Whately, possesses a damaged copy of the Latin Necronomicon and has been using it to breed something inhuman. Wilbur grows at an impossible rate. By age 10, he looks 15. By 15, he appears fully adult. Something is wrong with his body. He wears concealing clothes. Animals fear him. He smells wrong. Old Whately dies when Wilbur is 15, but not before teaching him how to use the book. Wilbur needs the complete text. His grandfather's copy is missing crucial passages. He travels to Miskatonic University, where Dr. Henry Armitage oversees the library's special collections. Wilbur requests access to the university's complete Latin Necronomicon, claiming he needs it for genealogical research. Armitage refuses. He's read enough of the book to recognize certain passages correlate with astronomical events happening now. in 1928. Something is building toward culmination, and this strange young man wants the exact text that would complete it. Wilbur breaks into the library at night. A guard dog attacks him. In the struggle, Wilbur's clothes tear away, revealing what's underneath. Above the waist, it was semi-anthropomorphic, though its chest had the leathery, reticulated hide of a crocodile or alligator. The back was piebald with yellow and black, and dimly suggested the squamous covering of certain snakes. Below the waist, though, it was the worst, for here all human resemblance left off and sheer fantasy began. The skin was thickly covered with coarse black fur, and from the abdomen a score of long greenish-gray tentacles with red sucking mouths protruded limply. This is what the Necronomicon's rituals produced. A hybrid, human enough to walk among humans, alien enough to serve other purposes. Wilbur dies from his wounds, but something else still lives at the Whately farm, something Wilbur was feeding and keeping contained. After his death, it breaks free. The thing is invisible, but massive. It destroys buildings, tears apart livestock, leaves footprints that look like barrel hoops pressed into mud, 16 feet across. People die. The creature is heading somewhere, following some instinct or instruction. It's Wilbur's twin, the successful product of old Whately's breeding experiments, grown to monstrous size, while Wilbur remained relatively human. Armitage finally understands. He goes to the library and reads the Necronomicon, finding the passages Wilbur had been seeking. The text describes Yog-Sothoth, called the Key and the Gate, explaining it exists outside normal space-time and can manifest on Earth under specific conditions involving astronomical alignments and proper rituals. Old Whately had invoked Yog-Sothoth and somehow achieved conception between the entity and his daughter Lavinia, Wilbur's mother, who disappeared years ago. Wilbur and his twin were meant to be anchors, human enough entities that could open gateways to allow the old ones to return. The book provides specific instructions. Yog-Sothoth knows the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the key and guardian of the gate. Past, present, future, all are one in Yog-Sothoth. He knows where the old ones broke through of old, and where they shall break through again. This isn't poetry. It's description of a being that exists at all points in time simultaneously, that can access any moment in history that serves as the mechanism by which entities from outside normal dimensions can enter ours. Armitage finds the counter formula. The Necronomicon doesn't just describe how to summon these entities. It documents how previous civilizations banished them or sealed them away. The text contains both threat and solution, compiled by people who understood these forces well enough to interact with them from positions of knowledge rather than worship. Armitage, along with colleagues Rice and Morgan, performs the banishment ritual as the invisible creature reaches Devil's Reef, the place where dimensional barriers are thinnest. The ritual works. As they recite the formula, the creature becomes visible, briefly, horribly. Witnesses see something vast and writhing, more like a worm than anything terrestrial, covered in tentacles and mouths and eyes scattered randomly across its surface. It's Wilbur's face repeated hundreds of times across an amorphous body. Then it's gone, dismissed back to wherever it came. From the gateway it was supposed to open now closed. What the Dunwich Horror reveals about the Necronomicon is crucial. It's a functional text. The rituals work. The descriptions are accurate. Old Whately used it to achieve interspecies breeding. Armitage used it to identify what he was facing and how to stop it. The book isn't mythological. It's technical documentation for interacting with entities and forces that exist outside human experience, but follow consistent rules once you understand them. The story also shows the book's preservation function. Armitage mentions the text describes how previous civilizations dealt with these incursions. Humanity has faced this before. The old ones have attempted return before. Each time, someone with access to the Necronomicon's knowledge managed to seal them away again. The book serves as institutional memory across millennia, preserving information about threats that recur on astronomical timescales. Threats that might be separated by thousands of years, longer than any civilization's historical memory, which is why the knowledge must be written down and preserved, even when it seems safely irrelevant. But here's the horror the story doesn't fully articulate. If old Whately could use the book to breed human-alien hybrids, if Yog-Sothoth responded to his rituals, then the Necronomicon's claims are simply true. These entities exist. They can be contacted. They can interbreed with humanity. The dimensional barriers are permeable under the right conditions. Everything the book describes about Earth's real history and humanity's temporary occupancy is fact, not fiction. Armitage saves Dunwich, but he can't save the larger truth he's now confirmed. The old ones are real. They're waiting. Eventually they'll return. The stars will be right, and there may not be someone with the right knowledge to stop them next time. The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, written 1927, published 1941, shows the Necronomicon's power to collapse temporal boundaries. This is Lovecraft's longest work, a novel-length investigation into how forbidden knowledge propagates across generations and what happens when you resurrect people who should stay dead. Charles Dexter Ward is a young antiquarian in Providence, obsessed with his ancestor, Joseph Curwen, a merchant who lived in the 1700s and died under mysterious circumstances in 1771. Ward discovers that Curwen was involved in something deeply wrong. He imported strange materials, conducted experiments in his farm laboratory, was seen with people who'd supposedly died centuries earlier. Ward finds Curwen's papers hidden in the foundation of the old Curwen house, including detailed notes referencing the Necronomicon and other forbidden texts. Curwen had been using formulas from these books to achieve resurrection, not metaphorical resurrection, actual physical reconstruction of consciousness from material remains. The Necronomicon describes bodies as containing essential salties, information encoded in physical matter that persists after death. If you have someone's remains and the right chemical processes and the correct incantations, you can reconstitute them. What returns isn't a ghost or zombie. It's the actual person, with their memories and knowledge intact, pulled back from wherever consciousness exists between incarnations. Curwen was systematically resurrecting historical figures and interrogating them. He wanted knowledge from the past, alchemical formulas, locations of hidden texts, information about entities and practices that had been lost or suppressed. He'd dig up graves, extract the essential salts, perform the resurrection ritual, question the returned person extensively, then dismiss them back to death once he'd extracted what he needed. He was building a database of forbidden knowledge by interviewing the dead. The Necronomicon provided not just the resurrection formula, but the protective measures necessary when dealing with what returns, because what comes back isn't quite right. The person has spent time outside normal existence, has accessed information not available to the living, has perspectives that no longer align with human concerns. Curwen kept his resurrected subjects in sealed chambers with specific symbols and binding formulas preventing them from escaping or exerting influence beyond what he intended. Ward finds all of this in Kerwin's papers and decides to continue the work. He believes if he's careful, if he follows the protocols exactly, he can resurrect Kerwin himself and learn what his ancestor knew. He sets up a laboratory, obtains Kerwin's essential salts from the buried remains, and performs the ritual. It works. Kerwin returns. But Ward has made a catastrophic error. He's resurrected someone who spent decades mastering these techniques, someone who's been dead for over 150 years and has spent that time in states Ward doesn't understand. Kerwin is more knowledgeable and more ruthless than Ward anticipated. Within weeks, Kerwin has imprisoned Ward's consciousness in some kind of limbo and taken over Ward's body. He's now operating in 1926 with access to modern resources and centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to continue his experiments. Dr. Marinus Bicknell Willett, Ward's physician, investigates when Ward's behavior changes drastically. He discovers the truth and confronts the thing wearing Ward's body. The climax involves Willett using counter-formulas from the Necronomicon to banish Kerwin back to death. But Ward's consciousness can't be recovered. Whatever Kerwin did to displace him appears irreversible. Ward's family is told he died from nervous exhaustion. The truth remains hidden. What this story reveals about the Necronomicon is more disturbing than what the Dunwich Horror showed. The resurrection formula means death isn't final. Consciousness is information that can be stored, transmitted, copied. The past isn't sealed. You can access it directly by bringing people back and asking them questions. This has staggering implications. Every historical figure, every ancient scholar, every person who died with knowledge you want, they're potentially recoverable. Death is just a storage state, but there's a price. What returns has been changed by the experience of death. The Necronomicon describes this obliquely, warning that resurrected entities possess knowledge they shouldn't have, that they've accessed information available only to consciousness, unbound by matter. They return with perspectives that make them dangerous to the living. They remember being dead. They know what lies beyond. And that knowledge makes them fundamentally indifferent to human concerns. Kerwin, in particular, demonstrates this. He's been resurrecting and interrogating people for centuries before his original death. He's interviewed beings from previous geological epochs, entities that lived on Earth billions of years before humanity evolved. He's extracted their knowledge about the old ones, about Earth's real history, about how reality operates beneath the surface that humans perceive. He's built a systematic understanding of forces that humans weren't meant to comprehend, and he wants to continue this work, gathering more knowledge, resurrecting more ancient entities, building towards some goal that the story never fully articulates, but that clearly involves preparing for the old one's return. The temporal horror here is profound. The past isn't past. The people you think are dead are recoverable. The knowledge that was lost can be found again. History becomes a database you can query directly. But accessing that database changes you. Ward wanted to learn from Kerwin and ended up being replaced by him. The dead don't return as servants or sources. They return as competitors, as entities with their own agendas, as consciousness that has been elsewhere and come back wrong. The Necronomicon in this story functions as master key to multiple locks. It provides the resurrection formula. It documents the protective measures necessary when dealing with what returns. It contains historical information about which dead figures possessed knowledge worth recovering. It describes entities from previous epochs that Kerwin is systematically resurrecting and interrogating. The book is simultaneously instruction manual, encyclopedia, and warning, though Ward only heeds the instruction manual parts, ignoring the warnings until too late. The story's final implication is darkest. This work continues. Kerwin was doing it in the 1700s. He's doing it again now, in Ward's body. When he's banished, his essential salts presumably still exist, stored somewhere, waiting for the next person to find them and repeat the cycle. The knowledge propagates across generations, not through normal transmission, but through resurrection. Each practitioner eventually being resurrected by the next, creating a chain of consciousness that extends across centuries. You don't learn from reading the Necronomicon. You learn from the people the Necronomicon teaches you to bring back from death. And those people aren't human anymore. They've been dead. They've been in the spaces between. They've accessed knowledge that exists outside time. When they return, they bring that knowledge with them. The Necronomicon is just the first step. The real forbidden knowledge comes from what you resurrect using its formulas. The book doesn't contain the worst information. It tells you how to contact the sources that do. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, other writers continued developing the Necronomicon mythology, though not always in ways that honored his original vision. The most significant early expansion came from August Derleth, Lovecraft's friend and literary executor, who began systematizing what Lovecraft had deliberately left ambiguous. Derleth imposed a good versus evil framework that Lovecraft never intended. He divided Lovecraft's entities into elder gods, benevolent, and old ones, malevolent, creating a cosmic struggle that gave the universe moral structure. The Necronomicon in Derleth's stories became a text documenting this war, providing formulas to summon the elder gods to fight the old ones. This completely inverted Lovecraft's philosophical project. Lovecraft's horror came from moral absence. The universe didn't care about humans because moral categories didn't apply at cosmic scales. Derleth reimposed meaning, making the Necronomicon a weapon in a battle between good and evil, rather than a document describing amoral forces. This systematization made the mythology more accessible but less disturbing. You could fight the old ones by summoning their enemies. You had allies in the cosmos. Humanity might actually matter in some larger scheme. All the elements that made Lovecraft's work philosophically horrifying were softened into conventional fantasy where heroes could make meaningful choices and achieve real victories. The Necronomicon became just another spellbook in a cosmic war, valuable for the power it granted rather than terrifying for the truth it revealed. Other writers in what became the Cthulhu mythos added their own contributions. Robert Bloch created De Vermis Mysteriis, Mysteries of the Worm, supposedly written by a sorcerer in 15th century Belgium and containing information about underground entities. Frank Belknap Long invented the Pinacotic manuscripts, stone tablets from an Antarctic civilization predating humanity. Clark Ashton Smith contributed the Book of Eibon from the lost continent of Hyperborea. These texts cross-referenced each other and the Necronomicon, building a library of forbidden knowledge where each text confirmed and expanded the others. The collaborative aspect created interesting problems. Multiple authors meant multiple interpretations. Some treated the entities as physical aliens. Others emphasized their dimensional otherness. Some made them defeatable. Others treated them as inevitable. The Necronomicon became whatever the current story needed it to be. Sometimes a history book, sometimes a grimoire, sometimes a warning, sometimes a trap. This flexibility helped it spread, but diluted Lovecraft's original concept of a text whose philosophical implications were more dangerous than its practical applications. By the 1960s and 70s, people were attempting to write the actual Necronomicon. The most famous is the Simon Necronomicon, published in 1977 by Lovecraft, Inc., and edited by someone calling themselves Simon. This text claimed to be translated from ancient Sumerian sources, combining Lovecraft's mythology with actual Mesopotamian deities like Marduk and Tiamat. It presented itself as real occult text that had inspired Lovecraft's fiction rather than being inspired by it, a reversal of actual causality that thousands of readers accepted. The Simon Necronomicon contains rituals, invocations, and seals, supposedly for summoning Lovecraft's entities through Sumerian magical practices. It's utterly inauthentic. Lovecraft's creations have nothing to do with actual Sumerian mythology, and the book's historical claims are nonsense. But it became enormously popular in occult circles. People performed its rituals. They reported results. A completely fabricated text based on a fictional text became treated as functional grimoire. Reality and fiction had collapsed into each other. Other Necronomicon editions followed. The Hay Necronomicon, edited by George Hay, claimed to be based on manuscripts by occultist John Dee. The Tyson Necronomicon, by Donald Tyson, presented itself as the Wanderings of Alhazred, allegedly the original Arabic text. Each version added layers to the mythology, treated the book as historically real, and generated more confusion about what was fiction and what wasn't. Academic and literary writers took different approaches. Lynn Carter wrote H.P. Lovecraft, the EEE books, attempting to provide scholarly context for the fictional texts. This meta-analysis treated the Necronomicon as legitimate subject for literary criticism, examining how Lovecraft built his mythology and what purposes the book served in his stories. Carter walked a careful line between acknowledging the fiction and treating it seriously as cultural artifact. More recent writers have used the Necronomicon in increasingly sophisticated ways. Alan Moore's The Courtyard and Neonomicon present the book as a linguistic virus, information that rewrites neural patterns in anyone who reads it, literally changing your brain structure. The magic is memetics, ideas that replicate and transform their hosts. This brings the concept into contemporary frameworks of information theory and cognitive science, while maintaining Lovecraft's core insight that some knowledge is intrinsically dangerous. Ruthanna Emrys, Wintertide, and Deep Roots reimagine the mythos from the perspective of the Aikinyipekti, persecuted, showing how the Necronomicon's knowledge might be transmitted through communities that Western culture tried to eradicate. Her books suggest the text preserves information about pre-human civilizations that have something to teach humanity about long-term survival and coexistence with the truly alien. This rehabilitates the book somewhat. It's still dangerous, but potentially valuable rather than purely corrosive. Video games and tabletop RPGs have probably done more to propagate the Necronomicon than any literary expansions. Call of Cthulhu RPG, 1981, made the book a central game element. Reading it costs sanity points, but grants knowledge necessary for defeating cosmic threats. This gamified Lovecraft's concept, translating "some knowledge destroys you" into a mechanical system where you trade mental stability for effectiveness. Thousands of players have experienced the book's fictional existence through this game, often more vividly than through reading Lovecraft's original stories. Video games like Eternal Darkness, Bloodborne, and countless Lovecraft-inspired indie titles feature variations on the forbidden text that grants power at the cost of sanity. The mechanical loop of risk versus reward captures something essential about the Necronomicon's function. You know reading it will damage you, but the alternative is remaining ignorant and powerless. The book becomes a choice: comfortable safety or dangerous knowledge. Most players choose knowledge. Most of Lovecraft's characters do too. The compulsion to know, even when knowledge is destructive, might be the most human response the Necronomicon generates. The proliferation of versions and interpretations has created a strange situation. The Necronomicon is now more real as cultural object than many actual historical texts. More people can tell you about the Necronomicon than about real grimoires like the Picatrix or the Sworn Book of Honorius. It exists in popular imagination more vividly than texts that actually exist in libraries. Lovecraft's fabrication has achieved a kind of hyper-reality, an idea so widely propagated that its fictional status becomes irrelevant to its cultural function. This creates the final paradox. By trying to write the real Necronomicon, by treating it as real, by propagating it through games and stories and occult practices, we've made it real in the only way that matters for ideas. It exists now independent of Lovecraft. It exists in the cultural unconscious. It's become the archetypal forbidden text, the template against which all dangerous knowledge gets measured. When scientists worry about information hazards, ideas that could cause harm simply by being known, they're working in territory Lovecraft mapped with his imaginary book. The Necronomicon has escaped its stories the way its knowledge escapes containment in those stories. It can't be controlled anymore. It propagates through culture, gets reinterpreted by each generation, means different things to different communities. Some treat it as fiction, some treat it as real, some treat it as something between, a fiction that reveals truths no factual text could safely articulate. And maybe that's the most Lovecraftian outcome. A book that doesn't exist having real effects on reality, changing how people think about knowledge and danger and the limits of what humans should try to understand. The line between fiction and belief collapsed completely in the 1970s when actual Necronomicon started appearing on bookstore shelves. The Simon Necronomicon hit occult shops in 1977, bound in black with a silver pentagram, claiming to be translated from ancient Sumerian tablets discovered in the 1960s. The introduction spun an elaborate tale about monasteries in the Balkans, secret societies, and manuscripts that predated Lovecraft by millennia. According to this narrative, Lovecraft hadn't invented the Necronomicon. He'd somehow learned about the real text and incorporated it into his fiction as a form of protective camouflage. Thousands of people bought this, not as curiosity or collectible, but as functional grimoire. They performed the rituals. They reported results, visions, entity encounters, psychological effects that matched what Lovecraft's characters experienced. Whether these effects came from the rituals themselves or from the expectation that dangerous rituals should have dangerous effects doesn't matter for the cultural phenomenon. People treated a book based on fiction as real occult text, and reality seemed to confirm their belief through subjective experience. The hoax worked because it exploited how esoteric knowledge actually circulates. Real grimoires have murky origins. They claim ancient sources that can't be verified. They pass through secret societies, leaving gaps in provenance. The Simon Necronomicon mimicked this pattern perfectly. Its fake history sounded exactly like real occult text histories. And crucially, it never definitively proved itself. It remained ambiguous enough that believers could maintain belief while skeptics could maintain skepticism. This ambiguity kept both groups engaged with the text. Libraries became unwitting participants in the mythology. Through the 1970s and 80s, librarians at major universities reported regular requests for the Necronomicon. Patrons wanted to see the copies supposedly held at Harvard's Widener Library or the British Museum. Some requests were from curious students who knew it was fiction but wanted to verify that fact. Others came from people who genuinely believed the book existed and expected librarians to produce it from restricted collections. The requests became frequent enough that some libraries created humorous Necronomicon files documenting their responses. The mythology spawned actual hoaxes by people claiming to possess authentic copies. In 1973, Owlswick Press published a leather-bound limited edition claiming to be translated from Greek. In 1978, Scoob Books in London issued another version claiming descent from John Dee's original English translation. In 2004, a purported authentic Arabic manuscript surfaced on eBay, complete with aged pages and Arabic script that supposedly predated Lovecraft. Each hoax added layers, creating nested fictions where determining which level you were operating on became genuinely difficult. The internet amplified everything. By the 1990s, you could download dozens of Necronomicon PDFs, each claiming different levels of authenticity. Forums debated which version was real, arguments that assumed at least one version must be legitimate rather than acknowledging they were all fabrications. People shared experiences from performing rituals, some clearly fictional, others describing genuine psychological disturbances that seemed to correlate with engaging deeply with the material. The question of whether the book was real became less important than the observable fact that treating it as real produced real effects on practitioners. Urban legends emerged, stories about people who'd read the real Necronomicon and gone mad or disappeared. These stories follow familiar patterns: friend of a friend, incident at unnamed university, details that can't be verified but feel plausible. One persistent legend involves a graduate student who accessed restricted texts in a university's special collections, read something in a manuscript labeled Al-Azif, and was later found catatonic, unable to speak but constantly drawing strange symbols. The story circulates with different details, but the same core. Somewhere, in some library, there's a text that will destroy you if you're not careful. The curse narrative attached itself to the book. People claimed misfortunes after engaging with Necronomicon material: relationship breakdowns, mental health crises, accidents. Whether these were normal life events reframed through the lens of having read a cursed book, or whether focusing on forbidden knowledge genuinely destabilizes people in measurable ways, the pattern held. The book developed a reputation for being literally dangerous, not to your eternal soul, but to your psychological stability and practical life circumstances. Chaos magic practitioners in the 1980s and 90s took a different approach. They treated the Necronomicon entities as servitors, thought forms created by collective belief that gained functional reality through sustained attention. This framework acknowledged the entities weren't real in a conventional sense, but argued they'd become real enough through cultural propagation to be useful in magical practice. Chaos magicians summoned Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth, not because these beings literally existed in some dimension, but because the cultural weight behind them made them effective psychological tools for transformation and ritual work. This raises uncomfortable questions about what real means for ideas. If enough people believe something, If it shapes behavior and generates consistent subjective experiences, does its fictional origin matter? The Necronomicon has now influenced more people, generated more cultural output, and produced more subjective experiences than most historically authentic grimoires. It's more culturally real than the Picatrix or the Key of Solomon, despite being completely fabricated. Hyperreality, the simulation more vivid than the original, describes the Necronomicon perfectly. The phenomenon extends beyond occultists. Academic researchers studying information hazards, ideas that cause harm simply by being known, use the Necronomicon as conceptual model. Computer scientists working on AI alignment worry about basilisk scenarios where certain information patterns could damage or subvert minds that process them. These contemporary concerns mirror exactly what Lovecraft proposed with his fictional grimoire: that knowledge itself could be structured in ways incompatible with human cognitive architecture, that understanding certain truths might be intrinsically damaging regardless of how you engage with them. The Necronomicon's cultural persistence suggests we need it. We need the idea of knowledge that's forbidden not by authority, but by structure, information that destroys rather than empowers, truth that costs more than ignorance. In an age where information is supposedly democratized and transparency is treated as universal good, the Necronomicon reminds us that maybe some doors should stay closed. Not because someone in power wants them closed, but because what's behind them is genuinely incompatible with the kind of consciousness that asks questions in the first place. The final irony: Lovecraft would have hated all of this. He explicitly told correspondents the book was pure fiction, cautioned against taking it seriously, tried to discourage the mythology even as he built it. But his attempts at clarification couldn't compete with what he'd created. The book escaped his control the way it escapes institutional control in his stories. You can tell people it's fake, show them the correspondence where Lovecraft admits inventing it, provide documentary evidence of its fabrication, and they'll believe you. And then they'll go looking for it anyway, because fiction that powerful stops being merely fictional. It becomes something else, not true but necessary, not real but inevitable. The Necronomicon made its film debut in 1981 with Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead, though significantly transformed. Raimi renamed it Naturom Demonto and Book of the Dead, bound in human flesh with a face on the cover, filled with incantations that resurrect demonic forces. This wasn't Lovecraft's grimoire of cosmic knowledge. It was pure supernatural horror, demons and possession rather than dimensional physics. But the film captured something essential: a book that should not be read, recordings that should not be played, knowledge that destroys everything it touches. The tape recording of a professor reading from the book becomes a transmission vector for horror, spreading corruption through audio medium into anyone who hears it. Evil Dead 2, 1987, and Army of Darkness, 1992, leaned further into comedy, making the book a plot device in time travel adventure. The Necronomicon became a MacGuffin, important because characters said it was important, dangerous because the narrative required danger, but stripped of Lovecraft's philosophical weight. You could defeat it with the right incantations. You could use it as weapon. It became manageable, reduced from existential threat to fantasy prop. John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, 1994, understood the assignment better. The film follows an insurance investigator tracking a missing horror novelist whose books apparently drive readers insane. The novelist has written something that breaks down the barrier between fiction and reality. His readers start experiencing the monsters, from his books as real entities. The film never shows a Necronomicon directly, but the novelist's works function exactly as Lovecraft's grimoire does. Texts that don't just describe reality, but alter it. Fiction powerful enough to rewrite the world. The investigator gradually realizes he's a character in one of these books, that his investigation is itself fiction, that distinguishing between what's real and what's written becomes impossible. The film's ending is pure Lovecraftian horror. The investigator, now driven mad by understanding his own fictional status, sits in a theater watching a movie about his investigation, laughing hysterically as he recognizes scenes he experienced as reality. The Necronomicon here becomes metatextual threat. The story you're experiencing is the thing destroying you, and there's no outside position from which to evaluate or escape it. You're inside the text. The text is inside you. The distinction collapses. Tabletop gaming gave the Necronomicon its most sustained exploration. Call of Cthulhu RPG 1981 created game mechanics around Lovecraft's concepts, translating forbidden knowledge destroys you into numbered statistics. Your character has a sanity score. Reading the Necronomicon costs sanity points but grants Cthulhu mythos knowledge, which provides information necessary for solving scenarios, but permanently lowers your maximum sanity. You become more effective but less stable. Eventually, either you go mad or you die, but you can't maintain both knowledge and sanity indefinitely. This mechanical system captures the book's essential horror better than most literary adaptations. Players face genuine choices. Read the book and become powerful but unstable, or remain ignorant and safe but ineffective. Most players choose knowledge because games reward effectiveness over safety. They watch their sanity scores drop, session by session, knowing madness is inevitable, but unable to resist the mechanical advantages forbidden knowledge provides. They're experiencing in game form what Lovecraft's characters experience in stories. The compulsion to know even when knowledge is fatal. The game also introduced the idea that multiple investigators could share knowledge without each paying full sanity cost. The book's danger could be distributed across a group. This suggests horrible implications. Maybe the reason occult societies and cults form isn't for power or community, but as psychological risk distribution. No individual has to bear the full cost of forbidden knowledge if you spread it across enough people. Secret societies become harm reduction strategies for information that would destroy solitary individuals. Video games picked up these themes. Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, 2002, featured a Lovecraftian tome called the Tome of Eternal Darkness that characters read throughout history, each reading advancing the cosmic horror plot while damaging their sanity meter. As sanity decreased, the game broke the fourth wall. Fake error messages, apparent system crashes, volume adjusting itself, save files claiming to be deleted. The game was gaslighting you, making you question whether what you were experiencing was game content or actual technical failure. The book within the game was affecting the game itself, breaching the barrier between fiction and player experience. Bloodborne, 2015, implemented similar mechanics through Insight, a stat that increases as you learn about the cosmic horrors underlying the game's world. Higher Insight lets you see enemies that were invisible before, perceive the truth of what's happening, but it also makes you more vulnerable, changes NPC behavior, alters the game world. The more you understand, the worse things become. You can't go back to comfortable ignorance once you've gained insight. Knowledge is permanent damage dressed as progression. Music found the Necronomicon useful as aesthetic, rather than concept, death metal and black metal. Bands adopted the imagery, albums titled Necronomicon, songs about opening the book and summoning ancient horrors, artwork featuring tentacles and forbidden texts. Bands like Morbid Angel based entire discographies on Lovecraftian themes, each album a grimoire chapter, songs as incantations. This was surface-level appropriation mostly. The horror of the music came from aggression and transgression, not from Lovecraft's philosophical dread. But some acts understood deeper implications. Bands in the dark ambient and ritual ambient genres created soundscapes meant to evoke the experience of reading forbidden texts. Droning tones, field recordings of wind and water, occasional whispered vocals in constructed languages. Albums designed not as songs, but as sonic environments, listening experiences that require sustained attention and produce genuine psychological effects through sound design. These recordings don't tell you about cosmic horror. They attempt to induce the psychological states Lovecraft described his characters experiencing. The proliferation across media demonstrates the Necronomicon's adaptability. It can be horror prop, game mechanic, philosophical concept, aesthetic signifier. Each adaptation emphasizes different aspects. Film tends toward visual horror and immediate threat. Games explore the risk-reward tension and mechanical consequences of dangerous knowledge. Music uses it as atmosphere and aesthetic frame. Literature continues mining the philosophical implications. The book serves whatever purpose the medium needs, which might be why it persists. It's conceptually flexible while retaining core recognizability. What's interesting is how adaptations often work against Lovecraft's original intent. He wrote horror based on human insignificance and cosmic indifference. Adaptations frequently make the book defeatable, the entities controllable, the knowledge ultimately empowering rather than destructive. This happens because most media needs protagonists to have agency and achieve victories. Pure Lovecraftian horror, where you can't win, where knowledge destroys you, where the universe doesn't care, doesn't work well in formats built around player empowerment or heroic narratives. The exception is when the medium itself becomes complicit, when games gaslight you by breaking the fourth wall, when films make you question what's real, when music induces actual psychological effects through sound design. The medium stops being container for the content and becomes infected by it. The Necronomicon isn't just depicted, it's enacted. The text you're engaging with is doing to you what the fictional text does to fictional characters. This is adaptation at its most disturbing and most true to source material. The ultimate media expression might be the internet itself, creepypasta, SCP Foundation, alternate reality games that blur fiction and reality. These are all descendants of what Lovecraft did with the Necronomicon, creating fictional texts that claim to be real, building elaborate documentation for things that don't exist, inviting audiences to participate in collaborative mythology building, where the line between what you're inventing and what you're discovering becomes genuinely unclear. The internet is perfect medium for this, because it's already a space where truth and fiction mix freely, where sourcing is often impossible, where things can become culturally real through viral propagation, regardless of factual basis. Every creepypasta that claims this really happened is following the Necronomicon template. Every SCP entry presented as classified document is using Lovecraft's techniques of false authentication. Every alternate reality game that hides clues in real locations and uses real phone numbers is collapsing the boundary between game and reality, the way the Necronomicon collapses the boundary between knowledge and madness. We're living in a media environment that makes Lovecraftian horror not just possible, but inevitable, where information spreads virally, where you can't verify sources, where engaging with any content means risking psychological contamination from ideas designed to replicate and transform their hosts. The Necronomicon prepared us for an age of information warfare, mimetic hazards, and cognitive pollution. Lovecraft wrote about a book that destroys minds through dangerous information. We've built a civilization where dangerous information propagates instantly to billions of people, where ideas can spread faster than our ability to evaluate them, where knowledge has become weaponized. The grimoire was warning and prophecy both. We didn't listen. We built it anyway. And now we're all reading from it, whether we realize it or not. The Necronomicon found unexpected life in academic philosophy departments starting in the 2000s, when thinkers associated with speculative realism began using Lovecraft as philosophical resource rather than mere horror entertainment. These weren't literary critics analyzing fiction. They were philosophers arguing Lovecraft had articulated genuine insights about reality, consciousness, and the limits of human knowledge that deserved serious engagement. Graham Harmon's Weird Realism, Lovecraft and Philosophy, 2012, treats Lovecraft's entities as genuine philosophical problems rather than monsters. Harmon argues Lovecraft was exploring object-oriented ontology, the idea that objects exist independently of human perception and withdraw from full access or understanding. Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth aren't supernatural. They're objects that exceed human cognitive grasp, that exist in ways we can partially perceive but never fully comprehend. The horror comes from encountering things that are real but fundamentally inaccessible to human understanding. This is Kant's thing in itself as tentacled nightmare, epistemology as horror. Eugene Thacker's 3-volume Horror of Philosophy series uses Lovecraft, and specifically the Necronomicon, as case study in cosmic pessimism, philosophy that takes seriously the possibility that existence is fundamentally negative, that consciousness is curse rather than gift, that the universe is indifferent or hostile to life and thought. Thacker doesn't treat these as metaphors for human alienation. He treats them as potentially accurate descriptions of reality's structure. The Necronomicon becomes philosophical text that happens to be written in fiction, articulating positions too disturbing to present through conventional academic discourse. This academic appropriation represents fascinating reversal. Lovecraft used scholarly apparatus to make fiction feel real. Footnotes, citations, academic framing devices. Now actual scholars are using his fiction to make philosophical arguments. The Necronomicon has become a legitimate reference in discussions about consciousness, materialism, nihilism, the limits of knowledge, and humanity's place in an indifferent cosmos. Academic papers cite it. Philosophy seminars discuss it. Universities offer courses on Lovecraftian philosophy. The book has achieved a form of reality through scholarly attention that its creator never intended. Meanwhile, in internet subcultures, the Necronomicon functions differently. On forums and image boards, it becomes shorthand for information you can't unlearn, for knowledge that damages you through comprehension rather than moral content. Users describe various disturbing truths about historical atrocities, about how industries operate, about ecological collapse, about AI risk scenarios, as Necronomicon-level information. The book's name has become adjective for any truth that's technically accessible but psychologically devastating. The SCP Foundation, collaborative horror writing project started in 2008, is direct descendant of Lovecraft's project. Users write documentation for fictional anomalous objects and entities, presented as classified files from a secret organization that contains these threats. The format mimics official documentation, using clinical language and bureaucratic structure to describe impossible things. Many SCP entries reference books that function exactly like the Necronomicon, texts that damage readers through comprehension, that spread like mental viruses, that contain information incompatible with human psychology. SCP-701 is a play that causes audiences to experience disturbing psychological effects, killing the actor playing the lead role in each performance. This is directly inspired by Chambers the King in Yellow, and by extension, the Necronomicon tradition. SCP-012 is an incomplete musical score that compels people to finish it using their own blood, driving them mad in the process. The Foundation contains dozens of these information hazards, songs that kill listeners, equations that destroy mathematicians who solve them, images that erase memories of everyone who sees them. The Necronomicon's core concept, knowledge as weapon, has become foundation for entire collaborative mythology. What's significant is that SCP entries are written collaboratively by thousands of contributors, none claiming exclusive ownership, all building on each other's work. This mirrors exactly how Lovecraft and his circle developed the mythos, collaborative world building, where the mythology becomes more real through accumulated cross-references from multiple sources. The internet enabled this process to scale globally. Now thousands of writers contribute to shared universes, creating nested layers of fiction that reference each other until determining what's source material and what's elaboration becomes impossible. Creepypasta communities do similar work. Stories like Candle Cove or The Russian Sleep Experiment present themselves as true accounts, inviting readers to treat fiction as documentation. The most effective creepypastas use academic or journalistic framing, experiment logs, news reports, historical accounts to create verisimilitude. They're using Lovecraft's techniques of false authentication, treating the Necronomicon model as blueprint for how to make fiction feel real through presentation style rather than content. Music subcultures appropriated different aspects. The dungeon synth genre, dark ambient music evoking medieval fantasy, treats the Necronomicon as aesthetic rather than philosophical object. Album art features grimoires and forbidden libraries. Track titles reference ancient tomes and forgotten languages. But this is mostly surface-level engagement, using Lovecraftian imagery for mood rather than grappling with Lovecraft's ideas about knowledge and madness. More interesting are the noise and power electronic scenes, where artists create genuinely difficult listening experiences. Harsh frequencies, distorted vocals, aggressive soundscapes designed to be unpleasant and challenging. Some artists in these genres explicitly frame their work as auditory Necronomicons, sounds that damage rather than entertain, listening experiences that require something from you rather than providing comfort or pleasure. This is art as information hazard, deliberately crafted to produce psychological effects through exposure. The occult revival of the 2010s saw new approaches to the Necronomicon, where earlier generations treated it as either fiction or dubious grimoire. Newer practitioners take a chaos magic approach. It doesn't matter if the book is real or the entities are real. What matters is whether treating them as real produces useful results. The Necronomicon becomes psychological tool for transformation, framework for exploring consciousness, method for accessing altered states. Reality of entities is less important than phenomenology of practice. This approach acknowledges Lovecraft's materialism while finding practical use for his creations. Yes, Cthulhu is fiction, but focusing attention on Cthulhu, performing rituals directed toward Cthulhu, using Cthulhu as symbol and psychological anchor, these practices produce real effects on practitioners. The entity doesn't need metaphysical existence to function magically. It needs cultural weight, which a century of propagation has certainly provided. Academic interest and subcultural engagement converge around the same realization. The Necronomicon represents something genuinely important about how information works. Not just in fantasy or horror contexts, but in actual reality. We live in an age of information overload, where exposure to certain knowledge about atrocities, about existential risks, about the scope of suffering in the world, can genuinely damage psychological well-being. We're recognizing that information isn't neutral, that some truths are toxic, that knowledge can be structured in ways that harm the knower. This is what Lovecraft intuited in the 1920s, and what we're confirming through lived experience in the 2020s. The Necronomicon isn't just horror fiction. It's model for understanding how dangerous information propagates and what it does to people who encounter it. Academics study it because it maps territory philosophy is only now beginning to explore. Subcultures use it because it provides language and framework for experiences they're having with information overload and existential dread. The book bridges high and low culture, academic philosophy, and internet horror, precisely because it addresses something universally relevant: the problem of knowledge that destroys. The Necronomicon endures because it articulates a fear that's only become more relevant, that understanding reality might be incompatible with functioning as human being. This isn't abstract philosophical worry anymore. We're living it. Consider climate change. The data is clear, the projections are devastating, the timescales for action are closing. Anyone who fully comprehends the scope of ecological collapse, who really integrates the knowledge of what's coming, often experiences something like the madness Lovecraft's characters experience when reading the Necronomicon. Not clinical insanity, but a kind of psychological break where normal human concerns become impossible to care about. How do you worry about your career or your mortgage or your social life when you understand you're watching the slow-motion collapse of conditions necessary for human civilization? The knowledge is true. The knowledge is also incompatible with continuing to function normally in society. You can understand or you can participate, but not both. This is Necronomicon logic, playing out in reality. Some truths are structured such that comprehending them damages your ability to operate within systems built on not comprehending them. We've created civilization that depends on certain comfortable fictions about infinite growth, about human exceptionalism, about the future being better than the present. Climate. Science reveals these fictions as fictions, and people who truly understand climate science often can't maintain normal lives. They become activists, drop out, suffer depression, experience the kind of existential despair that looks a lot like cosmic horror. Or consider artificial intelligence. Researchers working on AI alignment, trying to ensure advanced AI systems remain safe and beneficial, regularly encounter information hazards in their work. Certain research directions, if published, could accelerate capabilities in ways that increase existential risk. Some theoretical insights about how advanced AI might behave are themselves dangerous because they provide roadmaps for destructive outcomes. The field has had to develop informal norms about what knowledge should and shouldn't be shared publicly. This is exactly the Necronomicon scenario. Knowledge that's technically accessible but strategically restricted because dissemination increases danger. AI researchers also experience the psychological effects Lovecraft described. When you work deeply on understanding intelligence and consciousness as computational processes, when you model minds as algorithms, when you think seriously about what happens when those algorithms scale beyond human capacity, you often end up with conclusions that are philosophically disturbing. Consciousness might be less special than we think. Human intelligence might be surprisingly simple once understood. The things we consider uniquely human might be reproducible in silicon with no magic required. Understanding these things changes how you relate to your own mind. You start seeing yourself as meat-based algorithm, consciousness as process rather than essence. This knowledge is technically true and psychologically corrosive. The Necronomicon prophesied an age of information hazards, and we've arrived. Memetic warfare, viral misinformation, conspiracy theories that damage those who believe them, ideologies that radicalize through exposure. These are all forms of knowledge that harm the knower. Some of this is deliberately engineered. Some emerges organically through information ecosystems optimized for engagement rather than truth. Either way, we're recognizing that information itself can be toxic, that ideas can function as pathogens, that exposure to certain content can damage cognitive function in measurable ways. Social media algorithms curate feeds designed to maximize engagement, which means showing content that triggers strong emotional responses. Over time, this shapes how users think and perceive reality. Studies show prolonged social media use correlates with increased anxiety, depression, distorted perception of social norms, and difficulty distinguishing reliable from unreliable information. The platforms are information delivery systems that damage users through the process of delivering information. This is what the Necronomicon does. It's a transmission mechanism that harms through the act of transmission. The philosophical implications cut deeper. Lovecraft's materialism, his insistence that consciousness is just matter arranged certain ways, that there's no supernatural dimension, that humans aren't cosmically significant, has been largely confirmed by neuroscience and physics. We are biological machines. Consciousness does appear to be an emergent property of neural activity, with no evidence of anything else required. The universe is almost entirely empty space and dark matter, with life confined to thin film on one planet around one star among billions. We are exactly as insignificant as Lovecraft claimed. This creates genuine philosophical problem. If everything Lovecraft said about human insignificance is basically true, what do we do with that knowledge? Traditional religion offered cosmic significance. Secular humanism offers the consolation that even if we're not cosmically important, human values and experiences matter to us, which is sufficient. But Lovecraft's horror is recognizing that mattering to us might be the only mattering there is, and that on cosmic scales, it might not be enough. The Necronomicon represents this knowledge codified and concentrated. The book doesn't show you demons or hell. It shows you reality without the comforting illusions humans normally maintain. It's not that what it describes is supernatural. It's that what it describes is natural truth at scales and in configurations humans aren't designed to process. Our minds evolved to navigate social hierarchies, track predators, find food, reproduce. We weren't designed to contemplate billion-year timescales or grasp our own cosmic insignificance. The Necronomicon forces that contemplation. The madness that results isn't malfunction. It's accurate response to accurate information that our psychology can't integrate. This connects to debates in philosophy of mind about integrated information theory and panpsychism. Some theories suggest consciousness might be more fundamental than we think, that information processing itself might be proto-conscious, that the universe might be more alive than materialist frameworks acknowledge. These aren't return to religion or spiritualism. They're attempts to solve the hard problem of consciousness by suggesting consciousness is intrinsic to information processing at all scales. If true, this means the universe is filled with forms of consciousness radically alien to human experience, existing at different scales and substrates. This is exactly what the Necronomicon describes. Vast intelligences operating on principles incomprehensible to human consciousness. Not supernatural, but natural in ways that make them no less alien. The book's final implication might be about the relationship between knowledge and well-being. Enlightenment values assume more knowledge is always better, that truth is inherently valuable, that understanding improves life. The Necronomicon challenges this completely. What if some truths make you worse off? What if accurate understanding of certain things damages you more than remaining ignorant? What if there's a trade-off between knowing reality and functioning within it? We're starting to recognize this trade-off in mental health contexts. Depressive realism is a documented phenomenon where depressed individuals often have more accurate assessments of their capabilities and prospects than non-depressed individuals. Non-depressed people maintain optimistic biases. They overestimate their abilities, underestimate risks, believe they have more control than they do. These biases are inaccurate but functional. They help people persist through difficulties, maintain motivation, continue engaging with life. Depression often involves loss of these biases, seeing things more accurately, but finding that accuracy crushing. More accurate perception correlates with worse outcomes. The Necronomicon takes this to cosmic scale. What if accurate perception of humanity's place in the universe, of consciousness as accident, of meaning as projection, is similarly depressing? What if the illusions aren't just psychological quirks, but necessary components of functioning human psychology? What if enlightenment, seeing things as they really are, is actually incompatible with human flourishing? This is the question the book leaves us with, and it's genuinely unresolved. We've built civilization on assumptions about progress, meaning, and human significance that might be false. But they might be necessary fictions. Stripping them away reveals truth, but truth that makes continued civilization difficult or impossible. The Necronomicon warns that seeking truth without considering the consequences of truth is dangerous. Knowledge is power, yes, but it's also burden. And some burdens break the people who carry them. The book endures because we keep encountering this problem in new contexts. Every generation discovers truths that are difficult to live with. Every era has its own forbidden knowledge. Information that's accessible but costly, true but devastating. The Necronomicon gives us framework and language for this experience. It tells us we're not the first to face this, that humans have always struggled with the problem of knowing too much, that the tension between truth and well-being is ancient and unresolved. And it leaves the final question unanswered. Knowing what you know now, having read this far, having thought about these implications, was it worth it? Are you better off understanding, or would ignorance have been preferable? The Necronomicon never resolves this. Lovecraft never resolves it. And we can't resolve it either, because the answer is different for each person, and we can't know it until after we've already learned what we've learned. The book is warning and invitation both. You can't unread it. You can only decide what to do with what it's shown you. The horror is that you're still curious. Despite everything, despite all the warnings, you want to know more. And that curiosity, That inability to stop asking questions, even when the answers destroy you, might be the most human thing about us. The Necronomicon understands this. It counts on it. And that's why, a century after Lovecraft invented it, we're still reading, still searching, still unable to stop ourselves from opening books we know we shouldn't.